My name is Elena Vance, and for my 25th birthday, my father gave me a silver-plated lie. It arrived in a small, velvet-lined box that felt heavy with the weight of a miracle. I remember the way the light from my cramped, basement apartment caught the polished metal. I remember the handwritten card from my father, Julian, that said, "Something to help you find your way home. Love, Dad and Isabel." Inside was a keychain. Not a set of keys. Just a heavy, circular fob embossed with the logo of North Star Realty. At the time, I cried. I thought it was a promise. I thought it was a symbol of a down payment he had tucked away, or perhaps a hint at a trust fund finally being unlocked. I carried that keychain in my purse like a holy relic for 3 months. I would catch myself rubbing the cool metal during my double shifts at the pharmacy, whispering to myself that the struggle was almost over. That my father had finally seen me. But 3 months later, at a Christmas dinner surrounded by 12 people and the smell of expensive pine, the miracle curdled. My grandfather, Silas, a man with hands like gnarled oak and eyes that saw through every mask, leaned across the table. He didn't look at the expensive watch on Julian's wrist or the designer silk on my stepmother Isabel's shoulders. He looked at me. He asked me how I liked the lakefront condo. He asked if the floor-to-ceiling windows were as breathtaking in the morning light as the broker had promised. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. It sucked the air right out of the room. I looked at the $5 keychain sitting next to my plate. I looked at my father's face, which had turned the color of damp ash. And in that moment, I realized that for 90 days, I had been polishing the receipt of my own betrayal. My father hadn't given me a home. He had given me a souvenir of the life he'd stolen from me to give to someone else. But before I tell you how that dinner ended, and believe me, it ended with a bridge burned so bright you could see it from space, you need to understand the architecture of a lie this big. You need to see the blueprints. Because you don't just wake up one day and decide to rob your eldest daughter of her future. You build toward it, brick by brick, year by year, until the person you were supposed to protect becomes nothing more than a line item you can delete to balance your books. Growing up in the Vance household was a masterclass in atmospheric pressure. You didn't always see the weight, but you felt it in your bones. I was 10 when my mother passed, and 12 when Isabel moved in with her daughter, Caitlin. Within a week, the house I had known my entire life began to shrink. It started with the master suite at the end of the hall, the one with the bay window that overlooked the creek. That had been my room since I was in a crib. It was the room where my mother had read me stories until the stars came out. Julian sat me down at the kitchen table, his voice thick with that performative empathy he'd eventually perfect. He told me that Caitlin was having a hard adjustment. That she needed the big windows and the extra space to feel secure in a new home. He told me I was the strong one. The resilient one. He said it like it was a compliment, a badge of honor I should be proud to wear. So, I packed my life into cardboard boxes and moved into the finished basement, a room with a ceiling so low I could touch it and a single, high window that looked out at the tires of the family SUV. That was the first time I learned that my comfort was a currency my father was willing to spend to buy Isabel's smile. It became the rhythm of our lives. If there were 2 tickets to a show, Caitlin and Isabel went while I stayed back to keep the house safe. If there was a new winter coat, Caitlin got the wool designer brand while I got the synthetic hand-me-down because I was so good at taking care of things. I didn't complain. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I was terrified that if I showed the cracks, the whole house would fall down. I played the part of the grateful, invisible daughter, watching from the basement stairs as my father built a new family portrait that didn't seem to have a frame wide enough to include me. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that once I was an adult, the score would even out. I didn't realize that in a house built on favoritism, the only thing that grows is the debt you're expected to pay for the crime of being firstborn. The only person who never looked past me was Grandpa Silas. He lived 4 hours away in the rugged, timber-heavy hills of Wisconsin, in a house that smelled of cedar shavings and cold coffee. While Julian was busy climbing the corporate ladder and Isabel was busy curating their social standing, Silas was the one who actually taught me how to live. Every summer, when my father decided the house was too crowded for 3 growing girls and a busy executive, I'd be sent north. Julian called it a vacation. I knew it was an evacuation. But in that workshop in Wisconsin, I was more than a shadow. Silas didn't give me toys, he gave me a lathe. He didn't give me platitudes, he gave me a tire iron and told me to change the oil on his old Ford. The world will try to tell you that you're small, Elena, he told me once, his eyes fixed on a piece of cherry wood he was sanding. People will try to use your silence as a rug to walk on. But wood has grain. It has memory. If you bend it too far against its nature, it'll snap back and break the hand that tried to force it. I didn't understand what he meant then. I just knew that Silas was the only one who remembered my birthday without a Facebook notification. He was the one who noticed when my shoes were worn thin. He saw the way Julian looked at Caitlin, with a desperate, doting hunger to be the perfect dad, and the way he looked at me, with a weary obligation. Silas was a man of immense, quiet wealth, built from decades of land surveying and timber. He didn't believe in flash. He believed in foundations. He watched my father struggle to maintain the lifestyle Isabel demanded, the country club fees, the luxury leases, the private tutors for Caitlin. He saw the sweat on Julian's brow every time a bill arrived. And Silas, in his infinite, misplaced trust, thought he could solve the problem. He told me, years later, that he sat Julian down in that very workshop during a rainy October. He told Julian he wanted to do something final for me. Something that would ensure I never had to live in a basement or a cramped studio again. He told Julian he was wiring the funds for a lakefront condo in the city, close to the hospital where I wanted to work. He put the money in Julian's hands because Silas's hip was failing, and he couldn't handle the city paperwork himself. Put it in Elena's name, Silas had instructed. The deed, the title, the insurance. I want her to have a fortress. Give her the keys on her 25th birthday. Let it be the moment she finally stands on her own 2 feet. Julian had looked his father in the eye, taken the $450,000 wire transfer, and promised to be the steward of my future. He walked out of that workshop with my life in his pocket. And for 2 years, while I lived on ramen and worked until my eyes blurred, my father watched me struggle. He watched me choose between a bus pass and a grocery haul. He never said a word. He just waited for my birthday to arrive, knowing he had already spent my fortress to pay for someone else's throne. By the time I turned 25, I was living in a 400-square-foot studio in a part of town where the sirens never stopped. The ceiling had a water stain shaped like a teardrop, and the landlord, a man who smelled exclusively of menthol cigarettes, had just informed me that my rent was going up. I was tired. I was the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix, the kind that comes from realizing you are your only safety net. When the package arrived from my father, I truly believed the narrative had shifted. I saw the North Star Realty logo on that keychain and my mind raced. I thought, this is it. The condo. The investment. The hand up. I called my father that night, my voice trembling with a hope I hadn't let myself feel in a decade. I got the gift, Dad, I whispered into the phone. Thank you. I can't believe it. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the muffled sounds of a dinner party in the background, the clinking of crystal, Isabel's sharp, melodic laugh. Oh, the keychain? Julian's voice was breezy, almost dismissive. Yeah, I thought you'd like that. It's from a very prestigious firm. Silas was adamant you have a piece of the city for your big day. He's been a little rambling lately, you know? Talking about big investments and properties. Don't take him too seriously if he calls, honey. He's 75. The mind starts to play tricks. Wait, I said, the cold starting to seep into my chest. Is there something else? A folder? Paperwork? Myra, don't be ungrateful, Isabel's voice cut in from the background, though she wasn't on the line. I heard Julian sigh. It's just a souvenir, Elena. A symbol of where you're going. Silas thought it was important. Just keep it on you, okay? It's a North Star. It'll lead you where you need to be. I hung up and stared at the silver fob. It was beautiful. It was heavy. It was expensive for a keychain, sure, maybe $40 at a boutique. But it wasn't a door. It wasn't a roof. A week later, the first crack in the lie appeared. It didn't come from a confession. It came from an Instagram notification. My stepsister, Caitlin, who had just graduated from a liberal arts college with a degree in leisure studies and a mountain of debt that Julian had quietly settled, posted a photo. She was standing on a balcony. Behind her, the city skyline sparkled like a spilled box of diamonds. The railing was wrought iron, modern and sleek. She was holding a glass of champagne in one hand and a set of keys in the other. The caption read, "Home Sweet Home." My amazing parents surprised me with my dream condo for my graduation. Hard work pays off. I zoomed in on the photo until the pixels blurred. On the marble countertop behind her sat a thick, navy blue folder. Gold embossed letters arched across the front, clear as a mountain spring even through the screen, North Star Realty. My heart didn't just break, it stopped. I looked from the screen to the keychain sitting on my scarred wooden coffee table. The logos were identical. The branding was a match. I felt a surge of nausea so violent I had to reach out and steady myself against the wall. Coincidence is a luxury for people who haven't been raised in the shadows. I knew my father. I knew Isabel. And I knew that in their world, there was only one lakefront condo, and there was only one daughter who was allowed to live in the light. I picked up the keychain, my knuckles white, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the strong, resilient daughter. I felt like a hunter. I looked at the little silver North Star and realized Julian was right about one thing: it was going to lead me exactly where I needed to be. But as I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, I couldn't help but wonder, if the condo was in Caitlin's name, whose money was currently sitting in the North Star Realty escrow account? And more importantly, what would happen to Julian when Silas arrived for Christmas expecting to see his granddaughter in the home he'd already paid for? I stood in the lobby of North Star Realty 3 days later, the air conditioning humming with a sterile, expensive precision that made my thrift store coat feel like a neon sign of poverty. This wasn't just a real estate office, it was a cathedral of glass and white marble, designed to make you feel small before you even saw a floor plan. I clutched the silver keychain in my pocket, the metal biting into my palm. I wasn't here to buy. I was here to hunt for the ghost of a paper trail. The receptionist looked at me with a practiced, hollow kindness, the kind reserved for people who clearly can't afford the commission. I told her I was looking for a rental, something modest, but my eyes were scanning the digital displays behind her. There it was. The recent closings, real. A sleek, 2-bedroom unit on Lakeshore Drive. Unit 14B. The photos were a perfect match for Caitlin's Instagram. The same wrought iron balcony. The same view of the water that looked like a blue silk sheet. Is that Unit 14B still available? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Oh, no, she chirped, clicking a mouse. That one closed in late August. A private sale. Very quick. August, I whispered. The same month Silas had wired the money. The same month Julian had told me he was too stressed to come to my apartment for dinner. I leaned in a little closer. I think I know the owners. The Vances? She paused, her professional mask flickering for a split second. The buyer of record was a Mr. Julian Vance. But the title was recently transferred, a gift, I believe. She didn't need to say the name. I could see the shape of the theft now. Julian hadn't just used the money to pay off a debt or save his business, he had actively participated in a shell game. He took the fortress Silas built for the daughter he neglected and handed the keys to the daughter he adored. It was a clean swap. A life for a life. I walked out of that office into the biting Chicago wind, the realization hitting me like a physical blow to the chest. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was a crime. Not just against me, but against Silas. My father was betting on his own father's decline. He was counting on Silas being too old, too tired, or too confused to ever check the deed. He was treating my grandfather's legacy like an open ATM, and he was using me as the distraction. I went back to my studio and sat on the floor, surrounded by the smell of old radiator steam and damp wood. I took out a notebook and started a timeline. August 19th, the wire transfer. August 24th, the closing on Unit 14B. October 14th, my birthday. The day I received a piece of silver-plated plastic while my stepsister was popping champagne in a living room that belonged to me. The more I looked at the numbers, the more the rage settled into something cold and crystalline. I had spent 25 years being the resilient one, the one who could take the hit and keep moving. But Silas was right. Wood has a grain. And Julian had been carving against mine for far too long. He thought he had buried the truth under layers of gaslighting and expensive wine, but he forgot one thing: a foundation built on a lie eventually cracks. And I was going to be the one to drive the wedge into the first fissure. The invitation came on a Tuesday night, glowing on my cracked phone screen like a lure. It was a group text from Isabel, punctuated with heart emojis and sparkling tree icons. Christmas at the Manor. Christmas tree so excited to have the whole family together this year. Silas is making the drive down, so we need everyone at the table by 6 p.m. Dress code, festive formal. Let's make this the best one yet. Red heart. I stared at the word family until it lost all meaning. Isabel used that word like a weapon, a way to enforce a harmony that didn't exist. But it was the separate, private message from Julian that arrived 5 minutes later that really set my nerves on edge. Elena, listen. About Christmas. Grandpa has been having some very vivid delusions lately. He's been talking about that property again. If he brings it up, just nod and change the subject. It's for his own health. We don't want to agitate him. Please, for the sake of the holiday, don't make a scene. Don't make a scene. It was his favorite phrase. It translated to, accept your erasure quietly so I don't have to feel guilty. He wasn't worried about Silas's health. He was terrified. He was a man standing on a trapdoor, realizing the rope was starting to fray. He needed me there as a prop, the happy, independent daughter, who would confirm his narrative that everything was fine, that Silas was just a confused old man, and that the keychain was exactly the gift I had always wanted. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of fear for Silas. If they were willing to steal $500,000 from him, what else were they doing? Were they isolating him? Were they whispering in his ear that his memory was failing until he started to believe it? The thought of that proud, sharp man being dismantled by Julian's cowardice made my blood boil. I typed back a simple response: I'll be there, Dad. I wouldn't miss it for the world. I spent the next week preparing. I didn't call Silas. I knew Isabel probably monitored his landline or had Julian check in every day to gauge his mood. Instead, I went back to the only piece of evidence I had, the original birthday box Julian had mailed to me. I had kept it in the back of my closet, a habit born from years of having so little that I saved every scrap. I tore the bottom of the box open, ripping away the heavy packing tape. And there, stuck in the adhesive of the inner flap, was a tiny, jagged corner of paper that hadn't been fully cleared away. It was thick, cream-colored stationery. I could see the letters THST and a sliver of a signature line. It was a piece of a North Star Realty closing document. Whoever had swapped the deed for the keychain had been in such a hurry to hide the truth that they had ripped the document out of the box, leaving this one incriminating shard behind. It was a small thing, no bigger than a postage stamp, but in the silence of my room, it felt like a mountain of proof. I tucked it into my wallet, right next to the keychain. Two pieces of the same betrayal, waiting for their moment. The drive to the Vance Manor on Christmas Day felt like a descent into a beautiful, gilded nightmare. The house was a sprawling colonial, dripping in white lights and expensive wreaths that Isabel had undoubtedly hired a professional crew to install. It looked like a postcard for a life I had only ever viewed from the basement window. As I pulled my beat-up sedan into the driveway, wedged between Julian's Mercedes and the shiny new SUV he'd bought for Caitlin's graduation. The contrast was almost comedic. I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. My heart was a frantic drum in my chest. I wasn't just a guest, I was a whistleblower entering a room full of people who benefited from my silence. I walked through the front door and was immediately hit by the scent of expensive cider and wood smoke. The house was full of family, aunts, uncles, and cousins who only saw me once a year and usually spent that time asking if I was still doing that pharmacy thing. Isabel swept toward me, a vision in cream cashmere, her smile as sharp as a razor. "Elena. You made it. You look so practical. Come in, come in. Caitlin is just showing everyone her new photos of the condo. You have to see the marble she picked for the kitchen." She led me into the living room, where Caitlin was holding court, her phone being passed around like a trophy. My father stood by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in his hand, his eyes darting to mine with a desperate, silent plea. "Don't make a scene." And then I saw him. Silas was sitting in a high-backed armchair near the window, a plaid blanket over his knees. He looked thinner, his face a little more sunken than it had been in the summer, but when our eyes met, the fog Julian had tried to describe was nowhere to be found. His gaze was a laser, cutting through the chatter and the tinsel. I walked over to him, ignoring Isabel's attempt to pull me toward the appetizers. I knelt by his chair and took his hand. It was cold, but his grip was like iron. "You're here," he whispered, his voice a low gravel. "I'm here, Grandpa." He leaned in, his breath smelling of peppermint and old books. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about the weather. He looked me dead in the eye and whispered 5 words that made the room go silent in my head, even as the party roared on around us. "Elena, do you have it?" I felt the weight of the keychain in my pocket. I felt the sharp edge of the document fragment in my wallet. I realized then that Silas wasn't the victim I had imagined. He wasn't a man being fooled. He was a man who had been waiting for his witness to arrive. "I have it, Grandpa," I said softly. He nodded, a slow, grim movement. "Good. Because I've brought the briefcase. And tonight, we're going to see exactly what Julian thinks my signature is worth." Before I could respond, the chime of a crystal glass rang out. Isabel was standing at the head of the dining table, her face glowing with a triumphant light. "Dinner is served, everyone. We have a very special announcement to make before the main course." As we moved toward the table, Silas gripped my arm, pulling me back for one more second. "Don't blink, Elena," he hissed. "This is the part where the grain snaps." The dining room was a theater of excess. 12 place settings of gold-rimmed bone china caught the flicker of a dozen tapered candles, casting long, dancing shadows against the dark mahogany table. The air was thick with the scent of glazed ham and the artificial sweetness of Isabel's expensive perfume. My father sat at the head of the table, his spine rigid, his fingers drumming a nervous, erratic rhythm against the tablecloth. He looked like a man sitting on a ticking bomb, praying the clock would just stop. Opposite him sat Caitlin, glowing with the unearned radiance of a girl who had never known a cold Tuesday or a rent increase. She was scrolling through her phone, leaning over to show a cousin the view from her balcony. I sat next to Silas, whose presence at the end of the table felt less like a guest and more like a silent, looming judge. The briefcase he'd mentioned sat on the floor, tucked firmly against the wheel of his chair. "I just want to take a moment," Isabel began, standing up and raising a glass of vintage champagne. Her voice was pitched for an audience, vibrating with a practiced, maternal warmth. "To celebrate this incredible year. To Julian's hard work, to our beautiful home, and most importantly, to Caitlin. She's officially a homeowner now, and seeing her flourish in that gorgeous lakeshore condo, well, it's a parent's greatest dream come true." A chorus of "Here, here," rippled around the table. Crystal clinked. Julian took a long, desperate swallow of his scotch, his eyes refusing to meet mine. I felt the keychain in my pocket, a cold, hard lump against my thigh. I looked at Silas. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't smiling. He was staring at the North Star Realty logo on the centerpiece Isabel had tucked into the floral arrangement, a small, decorative house that matched the branding of the firm. "It's just so inspiring," a cousin chimed in, looking at me with a pitying tilt of the head. "And what about you, Elena? Still at the pharmacy? I suppose some of us are just slower to launch, right?" Isabel didn't wait for me to answer. She tilted her head in that specific way that signaled she was about to deliver a blow wrapped in a compliment. "Well, not everyone has Caitlin's drive. Elena is very independent. She prefers the basement life, I think. She's our little survivor." The table chuckled. It was a soft, polite sound, but it felt like sandpaper against my skin. I looked at Julian. I waited for him to defend me. I waited for him to say that I worked 60 hours a week so I wouldn't have to ask him for a dime. But he just stared at his plate, his jaw working silently. He had traded his spine for a quiet life, and he was currently watching the daughter he'd robbed being mocked by the woman he'd helped. I reached into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around the silver fob. The metal was warm now, heated by my own skin. I realized that the scene Julian was so afraid of wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a scream. It was the truth. And the truth, I was realizing, didn't need to be loud to be lethal. I leaned back in my chair, the silence at our end of the table growing like a dark cloud. Caitlin was laughing at something her mother said, her hand resting near a stack of envelopes Isabel had placed at her setting, cards filled with housewarming checks from the extended family. "Grandpa," I said softly, my voice cutting through the laughter like a knife through silk. "Did you see the photos of Caitlin's new place? The ones on Instagram?" The laughter died. Julian's glass hit the table with a sharp clack. Silas turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Caitlin's face. "I saw them," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. "Beautiful view. Expensive marble. Reminded me of a property I looked at back in August. A unit on Lakeshore. 14B, wasn't it, Julian?" My father's face went from ash gray to a ghostly white. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. Isabel's smile didn't fade, but it hardened, her eyes flashing towards Silas with a look of pure, calculated venom. "Oh, Silas," she said, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "You're getting your stories mixed up again. We talked about this. You were thinking about a project in Wisconsin. The city air is just making you a little foggy." She looked around the table, offering a conspiratorial wink to the aunts and uncles. "He's been having these little spells. It's best not to indulge the fantasies." I felt Silas's hand tighten on the arm of his chair until his knuckles turned white. He didn't look foggy. He looked like a man watching a wolf try to convince him he was blind. I reached into my wallet and pulled out the tiny, jagged fragment of the North Star document. I laid it on the white linen tablecloth, right next to my gold-rimmed plate. It was a small, torn corner of a lie, but under the candlelight, the printed name Elena Vance was unmistakable. The air in the room didn't just turn cold, it froze. Julian stared at the scrap of paper as if it were a venomous spider. Isabel's hand began to shake, her champagne sloshing against the rim of her glass. "Dad," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "Why is my name on the closing documents for Caitlin's apartment?" For a heartbeat, the only sound in the room was the crackle of the fireplace and the distant, muffled sound of a car passing in the snow. Julian opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Isabel, seeking a script, a way out, a final gaslight. But for the first time in 14 years, the basement daughter wasn't looking down. She was looking right through him. And then, Silas reached down and unbuckled the brass latches of his briefcase. The double click sounded like 2 gunshots in the silence of the manor. "I think," Silas said, sliding a thick manila folder onto the table and pushing aside a bowl of cranberry sauce, "it's time we talk about the difference between a gift and a theft. Because I didn't come here to eat ham, Julian. I came here to see if my son still has a soul." The table erupted. Not into shouting, but into a frantic, hushed panic. Isabel stood up, her face a mask of wounded outrage. "This is insane. Silas, you're making a scene. You're upsetting the children. Julian, tell him. Tell him he's confused." But Julian couldn't tell him anything. He was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, the weight of the $450,000 secret finally crushing him into the mahogany. "Sit down, Isabel," Silas commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order from a man who had spent 50 years commanding men in the wild. "You've spent enough time talking for my son. Tonight, the paper does the talking." He flipped open the folder. The first page was a bank statement. Bold, black ink. A wire transfer for $450,000. August 19th. The memo line was circled in red, for Elena's condo. Aunt Linda, Julian's sister, leaned forward, her eyes wide as she read the document over Silas's shoulder. She looked at her brother, then at me, then at Caitlin, who was looking at her mother with an expression of growing, horrified realization. "Julian?" Linda whispered. "Is this true? Did Dad give you the money for Elena?" "It was a misunderstanding," Isabel hissed, her voice losing its melodic quality and sharpening into a jagged edge. "The market was volatile. We decided as a family that it made more sense to secure Caitlin's future first. She's fine. She has her job. She doesn't need the handout like Caitlin does." "A handout?" Silas's voice rose for the first time, a roar that silenced the room. "That wasn't a handout. That was her mother's legacy. That was the wood I sanded with my own hands to make sure she never had to bow her head to people like you." He turned to me, his eyes softening for a split second, filled with a deep, aching regret. "I gave him the keys to your life, Elena. And he handed them to a girl who doesn't even know how to sand a piece of pine." Caitlin's face crumpled. She looked at the checks and the cards next to her, then at the photos on her phone. "Mom? You told me Dad saved for 3 years. You told me it was my graduation surprise. You told me Elena didn't want a place in the city." Isabel didn't answer her daughter. She was staring at me, her eyes filled with a pure, unadulterated hatred. "You ungrateful little brat," she spat. "We gave you a home for 14 years. We took you in when you had nothing but a basement and a sob story. And you want to ruin your sister's life over a few square feet of real estate?" "It's not about the real estate, Isabel," I said, standing up. My chair scraped against the floor, a loud, harsh sound. "It's about the fact that you and my father spent 3 months trying to convince a 75-year-old man he was losing his mind just so you could keep a secret. You didn't just steal the money. You tried to steal his dignity." I looked at my father. He finally looked up. His eyes were red, wet with a coward's tears. "Elena. I was going to pay it back. I was going to find a way to get you something later. Things just got complicated with the business loans." "Complicated?" Silas laughed, a dry, bitter sound. He pulled a second document from the folder. It was an email exchange between Julian and the North Star broker. The subject line read, "Title transfer, urgent." In the body of the email, Julian had written, "My father is elderly and prone to confusion. Please ensure all correspondence goes to my business address. We are switching the primary title from Elena Vance to Caitlin Vance for tax purposes. She is the intended beneficiary." The room went cold again. Tax purposes. The ultimate lie of the white-collar thief. "You use my age as a weapon against your own daughter," Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was far more terrifying than the roar. "You tried to bury me before I was even in the ground." He reached into the briefcase one last time and pulled out a single, legal-sized sheet of paper. He laid it on top of the pile of evidence. It was a fresh document, typed and signed by a notary. "This," Silas said, looking around the table at the stunned faces of the Vance family, "is a notice of a title dispute and a breach of fiduciary duty. My lawyer is filing it tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. But Julian, there's something else you should know. Something I didn't tell you in August. Julian looked at the paper, then at his father. What? Silas leaned forward, the candlelight reflecting in his sharp, steady eyes. I didn't just wire you the money for the condo. I placed a lien on this house, Julian. The one we're sitting in. The one Isabel loves so much. I signed it over to you 10 years ago on the condition that you maintained the family legacy. And since you've proven you don't know what that word means. He paused, letting the silence stretch until Isabel looked like she was about to scream. I'm calling the note, Julian. By the time the snow melts, this house belongs to the only person in this room who knows how to keep a promise. Silas looked at me, a small, grim smile touching his lips. And Elena. I think it's time you saw the view from the 14th floor. The room erupted into chaos, Isabel screaming, Caitlin sobbing, Julian begging. But all I could see was the small silver keychain on the table. It wasn't a souvenir anymore. It was a key to a door that was finally opening. But as I turned to follow Silas out of the room, I saw Julian reach for the folder, his eyes frantic. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at a specific page at the very bottom of the stack, one Silas hadn't mentioned yet. A page with a different name on it. A name that made Julian's hand stop midair, his face turning a shade of purple I'd never seen before. Dad, Julian choked out. Who is Marcus? The name Marcus hung in the air like a cold mist, dampening the fire Isabel had been trying to stoke. My father's hand stayed frozen over the manila folder, his fingers trembling just inches from the document Silas had left exposed at the bottom of the stack. Marcus. I didn't know the name, but the reaction it pulled out of Julian was visceral. It wasn't just fear, it was the look of a man who had forgotten he'd left a window open during a storm. Silas didn't answer immediately. He let the silence do the heavy lifting, watching the blood drain from his son's face until Julian looked less like a powerful executive and more like a ghost in an expensive suit. Marcus, Silas finally repeated, his voice devoid of warmth. Is the man who's been holding the leash you didn't think I knew about, Julian. He's the brother-in-law Isabel conveniently forgot to mention when she was telling me how independent Elena was. The one who loaned you $60,000 to keep your store expansion from collapsing 3 years ago. The one who told Isabel that if that loan wasn't secured by something substantial, something like a lakeshore deed, he'd call the debt and take the inventory. The room shifted. The aunts and uncles, who had been leaning toward Isabel's side out of sheer social habit, suddenly recoiled. The family decision Isabel had touted wasn't about tax purposes or Caitlin's future. It was a ransom payment. Julian had traded my inheritance to pay off a private debt to Isabel's brother. He hadn't just been a passive coward, he'd been a broker. He'd sold my roof to keep his shelf stocked. I looked at Isabel. The tears she'd been milking for the past 10 minutes dried up instantly, replaced by a hard, metallic glare. She didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. She just straightened her cashmere shoulders and looked at Silas with a terrifying level of pragmatism. Business is business, Silas. Julian was going to lose everything. The manor, the reputation, the lifestyle. I did what any wife would do to protect her household. I redirected a gift that Elena didn't even know existed to save the family that actually lives here. The family that lives here, Silas whispered, shaking his head. You talk about this house like it's a kingdom, but you've turned it into a pawn shop. You stole from a girl who has worked every day of her life since she was 18 to pay for a man's failure to manage his own books. He turned his gaze to Julian, his eyes full of a weary, final disappointment. You sold your daughter for $60,000, Julian. You had $450 in your hand, and you gave the rest to the woman who put the noose around your neck. Tell me, was the scotch tonight worth the price of your soul? Julian didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared at the name Marcus on the legal page, realizing that Silas hadn't just tracked the money, he'd tracked the motive. He had unraveled the entire web, from the wire transfer in Wisconsin to the private debt in Chicago. And as Silas reached out to take my hand, his grip steady and cool, I realized that the hard-hitting peak of this nightmare wasn't the theft itself. It was the realization that my father hadn't even hesitated. He hadn't fought for me. He hadn't looked for another way. He had seen a path to save himself, and he'd used me as the bridge to cross it. The briefcase clicked shut again, a final, percussive sound that felt like a gavel. Silas looked at me, a soft recognition in his eyes that I'd only ever seen in the mirror. He saw the wood grain he'd talked about. He saw that I wasn't snapping. I was holding. And as we stood up to leave that table of gold-rimmed lies, the rest of the family sat in a stunned, suffocating silence. Even Isabel had run out of scripts. Julian was a hollow shell, staring at a Christmas tree that suddenly looked like a pile of dead pine needles. "We're going, Elena," Silas said. "There's nothing left to eat at this table that isn't poisoned." We didn't look back as we walked toward the foyer. I could hear Caitlin's muffled sobs behind us, the sound of a girl realizing her dream home was built on the bones of her sister's life. But as I grabbed my coat from the rack, I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest. For 14 years, I had walked through this house feeling like a guest in my own life. Tonight, for the first time, I felt like the owner. We stepped out into the night, the Chicago wind whipping the snow into white sheets that blurred the edges of the manor. Silas didn't speak until we reached the car. He leaned against the door, his breath hitching slightly from the effort of the walk, and looked up at the darkened sky. "I should have seen it sooner, Elena. I should have known that a man who forgets his own blood for a title would eventually forget the value of $1. I'm sorry I let them make you feel small for so long." "You didn't let them, Grandpa," I said, my voice finally breaking. "You're the only one who didn't." He pulled a small, plain brass key from his pocket, not the silver keychain, not the plastic souvenir, but a real, heavy key. He placed it in my palm. "That's for the unit on Lakeshore." My attorney took possession of the physical keys this morning while Julian was busy pretending to be a host. The title transfer is being forced by a court order I had prepared in November. Julian signed the intent to transfer years ago when I set up the trust. He just didn't read the fine print that said I could revoke his stewardship for gross negligence. Turns out, stealing $500,000 qualifies. I looked at the key, the brass cold and honest in the moonlight. "And the house? The manor?" Silas smiled, a sharp, dangerous glint in his eyes. "That's for later. Tonight, you sleep in a room with windows that actually see the stars. But before we go, there's one more thing you need to see. One more gift." Julian tried to hide in the noise. He reached into his coat and pulled out a single, crumpled envelope. It was old, the paper yellowed at the edges, the handwriting unmistakably my mother's. My heart skipped a beat. "Your father found this in the safe when he was looking for the wire instructions," Silas whispered. "He was going to burn it. He told Isabel it was unnecessary clutter. But I saw him tuck it into his pocket. I took it from his coat while he was pouring that first scotch tonight." I took the envelope, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped it. The return address was our old house. The date was 3 weeks before she died. "Read it when you're inside your own walls, Elena," Silas said, stepping into the car. "Because the condo wasn't the only thing he stole. He's been keeping her voice from you for 15 years. I sat in the passenger seat as we pulled away from the Vance manor, the lights of the blessed household fading into a blur of white and gold in the rearview mirror. I held the letter against my chest, the brass key tucked into the fold of the paper. My father had sold my future to pay a debt, but he tried to erase my past to save his ego. The drive to Lakeshore was a blur of neon and salt-stained asphalt. We arrived at the building. The one I'd seen in the Instagram photos, the one that had felt like a taunt only days ago. The doorman recognized Silas and nodded respectfully, a silent acknowledgement of the man who had actually signed the checks. We rode the elevator in silence, the numbers ticking up toward the 14th floor like a countdown. When the doors opened, the hallway was quiet, smelling of expensive wax and peace. We reached Unit 14B. I stepped forward, the brass key heavy in my hand. I slid it into the lock. It didn't stick. It didn't protest. It turned with a smooth, mechanical click that sounded like the end of a long, exhausting war. I pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, but the city light flooded in through the floor-to-ceiling windows Silas had described. It was empty, no furniture, no lakeshore luxury, clutter, just wide-open spaces and hardwood floors that gleamed like dark honey. It was beautiful. It was silent. And for the first time in my life, it was mine. Silas stayed by the door, letting me walk into the center of the living room alone. I stood there, looking out at the water, the lake a vast, dark mirror reflecting the lights of a city that suddenly didn't feel quite so cold. I felt the weight of the letter in my hand. I felt the presence of Silas behind me, the last guardian of a history Julian had tried to pave over. "I'll leave you to it, sweetheart," Silas said softly. "I'm staying at the Drake tonight. My lawyer will be calling Julian at 8 a.m. sharp. Tomorrow, the world starts to look very different for the Vances." "Thank you, Grandpa," I whispered, not turning around. The door closed softly behind him, leaving me in the silence of my own fortress. I sat on the floor, the cold wood a grounding comfort, and finally opened the yellowed envelope. I pulled out the single sheet of paper, my mother's elegant, looping script filling my vision. "To my bravest Elena," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means you've finally found the place I tucked away for you. It means the grain has snapped back, just like Silas promised it would. There is something Julian hasn't told you about the day we bought this land, something about the name on the second deed." I stopped breathing. The second deed. I looked at the letter, then at the empty, shadows-drenched hallway of my new home. If Julian had stolen the condo money, and Silas had called the note on the manor. What was the second deed? I turned the page, my eyes racing to the bottom, where a map had been crudely drawn in the margin. It wasn't a map of the city. It was a map of the Wisconsin woods, the land Silas had surveyed 40 years ago. And there, marked with a heavy X, was a plot of land that didn't belong to Silas or Julian. It was a plot of land that had been registered in the name of a person I hadn't thought about in years. A person who wasn't a Vance, and wasn't a member of Isabel's family. The name on the deed wasn't mine. It wasn't Caitlin's. It was the name of the man who had picked up the phone at the North Star office 3 days ago when I'd called to check the closing date. The man who had sounded so familiar, yet so out of place. I looked back at the letter, my heart hammering against my ribs. My mother's final words weren't a blessing. They were a warning. "Elena, don't trust the silver star. The key you're holding is only half the lock. To find the rest, you have to ask your father one question: who is the man in the basement of the North Star?" The question in my mother's letter didn't just haunt the silence of my new apartment, it dismantled it. The man in the basement of the North Star. I stood in the center of Unit 14B, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of a city that suddenly felt like a massive, intricate trap. I looked down at the brass key. It had opened this door, but according to the yellowed paper in my hand, it was only half the lock. I thought back to my visit to the realty office, the sterile marble, the humming air, and the brief, strange phone call I'd overheard from the back office while waiting for the receptionist. A man's voice, low and frantic, arguing about the basement files and the Vance discrepancy. I hadn't thought much of it then, distracted by the sight of Caitlin's Instagram backdrop. Now, it was the only thing I could hear. I didn't sleep. I spent the night paced out on the hardwood, watching the snow accumulate on the balcony railing. By 7 a.m., I was back in my car, the heater screaming against the Chicago frost. I didn't go to the hospital for my shift. I went to the North Star. But I didn't walk through the front glass doors this time. I drove around to the service alley, where the delivery trucks and the maintenance crews vanished into the belly of the building. The service entrance was a heavy steel door, propped open by a stray piece of lumber. I slipped inside, the smell of expensive wax replaced by the scent of wet concrete and old paper. The elevator here didn't have a floor 14. It had a button worn smooth by fingers that didn't want to be seen. I pressed it. The descent was slow, the cables groaning like a long-held secret. When the doors opened, I wasn't in a realty office anymore. I was in a bunker. Rows of filing cabinets stretched into the dim fluorescent light, but at the very end of the hall, there was a small glass-walled office. Inside sat a man. He looked like an older, more exhausted version of the person I'd seen in my mother's old photos. He was surrounded by ledger books and digital drives, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of a monitor. I walked toward him, my footsteps echoing on the concrete. He didn't look up until I was standing right at the glass. When he finally did, the color drained from his face so fast I thought he might collapse. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't ask how I got down there. He just stared at my eyes, my mother's eyes, and whispered a name I hadn't heard in a decade. Elena. You're 15 years late. The man was Arthur, my mother's younger brother. The black sheep Julian had told me moved to Europe and died in a climbing accident. But Arthur hadn't died. He had been hidden. He told me, his voice trembling as he pulled a secondary deed from a locked drawer, that Julian hadn't just stolen my condo money. He had been using the North Star Realty group as a front to launder the timber profits from Silas's land for years, profits that were legally mandated to go into a trust for me the moment I turned 21. Arthur had been kept here, working in the shadows of the basement, promised that if he kept the books clean, Julian would keep him out of prison for a debt Arthur had incurred years ago. My father hadn't just been a thief, he was a warden. He had turned his own family into a ghost to protect a fortune that didn't belong to him. I walked out of that basement with a digital drive that contained every wire, every forged signature, and every cent Julian had diverted from my mother's estate into Isabel's private accounts. This wasn't just about a condo anymore. This was about a kingdom built on a graveyard. The fallout was a silent, clinical execution. On Monday morning, while the rest of the city was waking up to a gray, slushy work week, Silas's attorney didn't just file a title dispute. He delivered a box to the district attorney's office. By noon, the festive manor was surrounded by black sedans. I didn't go to watch. I didn't need to see Julian being led out in handcuffs to understand that the grain had finally snapped. The story in the local papers was brief but scandalous. Local executive arrested in multi-million-dollar fiduciary fraud. They didn't mention the basement daughter. They didn't mention the $5 keychain or the rollaway caught on the Myrtle Beach vacation. They didn't have to. The silence that followed Julian's arrest was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Isabel disappeared within 48 hours. She didn't stay to fight for Julian. She didn't stay to comfort Caitlin. She took what jewelry hadn't been seized and fled to her brother Marcus's estate in Florida, leaving a trail of healing journey posts on social media that finally, mercifully, went unliked. Caitlin was the one who surprised me. She called me from a motel room 3 days later. She had left the condo, the stolen throne, as she called it. She told me she was working at a vet clinic, starting over with nothing but a suitcase and the realization that the woman who raised her was a stranger. I can't keep it, Elena, she said, her voice thin and shattered. I can't live in a place that cost you so much. I gave the keys to Silas's lawyer this morning. I know, I said. He told me. Are we ever going to be okay? She asked. I looked at the silver keychain, still hanging by my door. I don't know, Caitlin. But for the first time, we're both telling the truth. That's a start. The store expansion collapsed. The Vance building supply was liquidated to pay back the creditors and the stolen trust funds. The manor was sold to a developer who planned to turn it into a historical library, a fitting end for a house that had held so many dark stories. Julian was sentenced to 6 years. He sent me a letter from the county jail, but I didn't open it. I didn't need his apologies or his explanations. I had my mother's letter, and I had Silas's woodworking lessons. I had everything I needed. I sat on my balcony on a clear February night, the lake a vast, quiet expanse beneath me. I wasn't the strong, resilient girl anymore. I was a woman who had seen the bottom of the lie and climbed back out. I had a home. I had a name that meant something. And I had a grandfather who still called me every Sunday morning to talk about the grain of the wood and the memory of the stars. I looked at the keychain one last time. It was a cheap piece of metal, a $5 insult that had nearly cost me my soul. I didn't throw it away. I took a hammer from my new toolkit, the one Silas had given me, and I flattened it. I hammered it until the North Star logo was nothing but a distorted smudge of silver. Then, I took that piece of scrap metal and I buried it in a pot of Wisconsin soil on my windowsill, where I was growing a small, stubborn cherry tree. The truth is, forgiveness isn't a feeling. It's a boundary. It's the moment you decide that someone else's debt to you no longer defines your worth. My father owed me a childhood, a home, and a father's love. He couldn't pay it back, so I stopped asking. I closed the ledger. I walked away from the spreadsheet of my own pain and stepped into the light of my own living room. If you're listening to this, and you're the one currently sleeping on the rollaway cot, I want you to hear me. You are not the resilient one. You are not an adjustment. You are the grain of the wood, and you have a memory. The people who try to bend you are only proving how much power you actually have. Don't wait for them to give you the keys. The keys are already in your hand. You just have to stop polishing the chains they gave you instead. My name is Elena Vance. I am 26 years old. I am a homeowner, a survivor, and a daughter who finally found her way home. The view from the 14th floor is exactly what Silas promised. It's breathtaking. But the best part isn't the skyline. It's the silence. The quiet, honest silence of a life that belongs entirely to me. I stood up and walked back inside, the glass door sliding shut with a smooth, solid click. I turned off the lights, letting the city glow fill the room. I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. I had found the North Star, and it hadn't been a realty logo or a silver fob. It had been the voice inside me that finally learned to say, I am enough. The snow began to fall again, soft and white, erasing the footprints of the day. Tomorrow would be another shift at the pharmacy, another day of work, another day of living. But tonight, I slept in my own fortress. And for the first time in my life, when I closed my eyes, I didn't dream of escaping. I dreamed of staying. Because justice isn't just about what you take back from the people who hurt you. It's about what you build in the space they left behind. And my foundation? It was finally made of cherry wood, strong, deep-grained, and impossible to break. Thank you for listening. If this story found you when you needed it, please, don't just carry the keychain. Find the door. And when you do, don't forget to change the locks. You deserve a home where the windows actually open. Good night.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.